In the heart of Lower Saxony, among the rolling, forested hills near Kaelfeld, the land held a secret destined to subvert the established historical narrative. It was 2008 when an amateur finder, armed with a metal detector, reported an anomalous find, some metal finds that seemed ancient. The archaeologists called to investigate were perhaps expecting the remains of a small camp, a trading post along a forgotten road. What emerged from the clods and undergrowth, however, was something extraordinary and, according to history books, fundamentally impossible. A Roman battlefield north of the Weser River, dating back to the 3rd century AD. The very concept was heretical. Why would a Roman army, centuries after the defeat of Varus in the Teutoburg forest and the official abandonment of any ambition to conquer Germania Magna, fight a great battle in that hostile and profoundly barbaric territory? Every fragment of iron, every lead bullet unearthed was an unanswered question, a fragment of a lost tale. The Harzhorn site was not a site of a one-sided massacre, as Teutoburg might have been, but the scene of a complex and violent clash between two organized forces. The land yielded not only Germanic weapons, but an impressive amount of Roman equipment: caliga nails, knitted larica parts, pilum points, and, above all, the lethal pine cone-shaped projectiles for field ballistae. Each object was a word in a code to be deciphered, which spoke of a legion on the move, not of an annihilated column. This discovery forced historians to do a dramatic rewrite. No longer the story of an empire in static defense behind its fortified borders, the limes, but the story of a sudden, powerful Roman incursion into the bowels of Germany. An operation that challenged every geopolitical assumption of the time. To understand the enormous scope of this incursion, we must immerse ourselves in the convulsive world of the year 235 AD. The Roman Empire found itself at a tragic crossroads. With the assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus and his mother Julia Mamaea in Mainz, the Severan dynasty came to an abrupt end, the last one that had guaranteed, despite the cracks, a century of relative stability. That year became known as the Year of the Six Emperors, a whirlwind of coups and civil wars that ushered in the darkest period of the 3rd century, military anarchy. The collapse of central power was simultaneous with unsustainable external pressures. To the east, the revived Persian power of the Sasanians threatened the eastern provinces with their armored cavalry. On the Danube, the Gothic tribes began their first incursions. And along the Rhine, a new and fearsome confederation of Germanic peoples, the Alemanni, was pressing with growing force against the limes. The empire was a giant in crisis, assailed from all sides while its political and economic foundations trembled. The currency was devalued, power was bought with the gold of the legions, and confidence in the eternity of Rome wavered. In this context, the Germanic frontier took on a particular meaning. After the unfortunate defeat of Publius Quintilius Varus in 9 AD, Augustus' dream of making Germany up to the Elbe a Roman province had evaporated forever. Imperial policy was oriented towards a consolidated defense. The Germanic Rhaetian limes, a barrier made of palisades, ditches, watchtowers and legionary fortresses such as those of Mogontiacum, Mainz, or Castra Regina, Regensburg. It was a military border, a fortified scar that separated the ordered world of Roman civilization from the primordial chaos of the Barbaricum. Beyond that line, according to traditional historiography, Rome no longer projected an offensive power, but only a defensive one. Germany had become a mythical land of impenetrable forests and ferocious tribes, a place of defeat and painful memories, not of conquest. On the other side of the border, however, the barbaric world had changed. The small tribes of the Chatti, the Cherusei, the Semnoni were coagulating into larger and more dangerous political-military entities. The Alemanni, whose name itself means all men or men united, were the emblem of this evolution. No longer simple bands of raiders, but a warrior confederation capable of fielding considerable armies, coordinating large-scale attacks and openly challenging the power of Rome. Their raids were not simple pillages, but tests of strength against a perceived vulnerable empire. The Battle of the Harzhorn, therefore, does not fit into the old narrative of expansionist Rome against the dispersed barbarians, but into the more dramatic one of an empire in crisis which, in the hour of its greatest internal danger, still finds the strength to launch a deep, audacious blow into the very heart of the nascent power that threatens its borders. It is the last, powerful reflection of a wounded but still lethal animal, which proves to its enemies and to itself that its fangs are long and its step can still echo, menacingly, in the forests where everyone believed that its dominion was only a memory. The discovery of the Harzhorn is the material proof of this reflection, the physical trace of a forgotten epic, buried under the silence of centuries and the carpet of leaves of a German hill, waiting to return to light to tell a different story. The figure that emerges from the mists of this forgotten history to lead the extraordinary undertaking is that of Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, a man whose very rise represents a revolution against the ancient order. Born in a border province, in Thrace or perhaps in Moesia, to a very humble family of shepherds, Maximinus was the living embodiment of an empire that was changing its skin. Not a Roman aristocrat raised in purple and rhetoric, but a career soldier, a physical giant whose stature and strength became legend in the chronicles. His was a career made entirely in the army, that changing body that now held the true supreme power. In March 235 AD, the legions stationed along the Rhine, exasperated by the conciliatory and perhaps perceived weak policy of the Emperor Alexander Severus and his mother Julia Mamaea, suddenly acclaimed this general as Augustus. It was an act of pure strength, a challenge to the Senate and the traditional establishment. Maximinus the Thracian, the soldier, became emperor not by inheritance or senatorial decree, but by the will of the sword. His reign formally inaugurated 50 years of military anarchy, an era in which the Praetorian Guard or the frontier legions made and unmade sovereigns. To legitimize a power born from such a coup, Maximinus could not rely on speeches or ancient rites. He needed a crushing, tangible victory that spoke the universal language of strength and spoils. He had to prove himself to be the protector of the empire, the one who could strike the enemies where no one expected to see eagles anymore. The campaign that led to the unknown Harzhorn plateau was therefore born from this existential necessity. The sources of the time, mainly Herodian, tell us of a punitive expedition against the Germanic tribes who had crossed the border. But the archaeological discovery forces us to radically review the scale and ambition of this operation. It was not a simple raid along the limes to repel some raiders. The finds found hundreds of kilometers north of the Rhine, in the heart of modern Lower Saxony, speak of an in-depth campaign, an invasion in all respects. This changes the perspective from reaction to strategic initiative. Maximinus wasn't just punishing, he was sending a very clear message, intended for multiple audiences. To the Germans, to show that Rome could still bring war to their most remote lands, devastate their sanctuaries and capture their populations. To his own legions, to cement their loyalty with the plunder and glory of an undertaking that echoed the deeds of the great republican leaders. To the Senate and the people of Rome, to demonstrate that the new emperor, however rude and foreign, was a winner capable of re-establishing the fear of the Roman name. Perhaps, in his heart, Maximinus dreamed of something more, a symbolic reconquest, the rectification of Teutoburg's historical defeat through an overwhelming demonstration of strength in the same type of territory that had engulfed Varus legions. The organization of such an expedition was a titanic logistical undertaking, a masterpiece of military planning that only the Roman war machine, even in a period of crisis, could still deploy. An army of tens of thousands of men, with its horses, pack mules, and dismantled siege engines, had to be moved through enemy territory, devoid of paved roads and reliable supplies. The column had to be self-sufficient for weeks, perhaps months. Quartermasters had to account for every ounce of grain, every spare nail, every javelin shaft. The march itself was a military operation, not a disorderly advance, but a progressive and methodical pincer or phalanx movement through the forests and valleys of Germany. The reconnaissance units, Germanic explorers in the service of Rome or light cavalry, had to scan the terrain in search of practicable paths, safe fords and potential ambushes. The main column, kilometers long, marched in constant alert, ready to transform from marching order to battle formation in a matter of minutes, as the Harzhorn finds will demonstrate. Every step away from the Rhine represented a calculated gamble, a bet on the discipline of the troops, on the efficiency of the chain of command and on the iron will of the man who led them. Maximino, the soldier, knew every detail of this complex machine. He was leading his army not towards a known border, but towards the darkness of history and geography, towards those same forests that Roman tradition considered the extreme limit of the civilized world. The final goal was perhaps not a specific place, but the very act of crossing it, of demonstrating that the power of Rome knew no boundaries when guided by an iron will. The Battle of the Harzhorn would be the violent, unexpected fruit of this titanic march through the unknown. The confrontation that was preparing on the wooded slopes of the Harzhorn was not the clash between two rigidly separated worlds, but rather the meeting clash of two evolving war machines, a mirror of the turbulence of the century. The army that Maximin led into the heart of Germany was very different from the classic Augustan legion, although it maintained its disciplinary core and iron organization. It was a composite force, a patchwork of specialized units that reflected the military professionalization of the 3rd century crisis. At its center there were probably vexellations, elite detachments taken from the Rhine and Danube border legions, such as the Legio II Italica or the 3 Italica, veterans hardened by constant skirmishes. These were flanked by numerous auxilia units, auxiliary troops often recruited from the Balkan provinces, known for their ferocity and resilience. The true queen of the late imperial battlefield, however, was cavalry, and Maximinus' army had plenty of them. From the agile teams of scouts and archers on horseback, essential for reconnaissance in hostile territory, to the fearsome cataphractarii, heavily armored knights both themselves and their steeds, an ideal shock force for the breakthrough. The archaeological evidence from the Harzhorn definitely points to the crucial role of another unit, the Equites Dalmatarum, light but extremely versatile Dalmatian horsemen, experts in disruptive combat, pursuit and rapid flanking maneuvers. To complete the picture, the field artillery, the carabalisti, mounted on wagons for unprecedented mobility, machines that could hurl lead and stone projectiles with deadly precision, transforming every defensive position into a target. On the other side of the field, the Germanic coalition that had gathered to oppose the invasion embodied the new threat that Rome was learning to fear. No longer disorganized hordes, but a structured tribal army, composed mainly of Alemannic warriors, perhaps supported by contingents of Catti or other tribes from the region. Their strength lay in perfect knowledge of the terrain, and in a ferocity motivated by the defense of the land. The German infantry fought based on wedge formations or side-by-side shields, banking everything on the overwhelming initial impact. They were armed with the long framei, spears used both for throwing and hand-to-hand combat, long swords often of Roman make, fruit of trade or booty, and short and lethal war axes, the Francisci, designed to be thrown before the clash to disrupt the enemy lines. Their shields, broad and flat, formed an effective barrier. Their cavalry was light, fast, ideal for rapid raids and pursuit, but could not withstand the head-on collision with the armored Roman cataphracts. The real German advantage, in addition to terrain, was mobility and the ability to dissolve and regroup quickly in the forest. The technology of the clash, crystallized in the site's finds, tells a story of adaptation and violent interaction. Roman equipment shows a transition. Alongside the traditional heavy pilum, we find heavy use of plumbati, heavy lead bolts thrown by hand at medium distances, a terrible weapon that could penetrate shields and armor before contact. Swords have become longer, the spada gradually supplants the short gladius, to strike from a greater distance. Chain armor is ubiquitous. But it is the mobile light artillery that represents the real tactical innovation in the field. The pine cone-shaped lead projectiles found in hundreds, often in concentrated groups, indicate that the carabalisti were not statically deployed, but maneuvered during the clash to support the infantry's advance, a modern and devastating concept against an enemy without similar means of response. The choice of the battleground, the wooded heights of the Harzhorn, was not accidental. It was a natural checkpoint on an ancient trade route, perhaps a branch of the Amber Road, that passed through the wooded foothills. The German commanders, knowing the area perfectly, chose that place to exploit the topographical advantage, an obligatory passage where the long Roman column would have been forced to spread out and slow down, becoming vulnerable. They placed their forces on the wooded slopes and on the ridge, ready to fall from above on an enemy hindered in their march. Their calculation was classic and had worked in the Teutoburg forest, to force the Roman war machine to fight in a confined space, denying it the opportunity to display its superior discipline in the open field. What they perhaps did not fully calculate was the quick reaction of a Roman army now accustomed to living in constant alert on the border, and the mobile firepower that column, even on the march, brought with it. The Romans, for their part, allowed themselves to be drawn into that potential trap because the road was the right one, the only one practicable for an army of that size with its wagons. They accepted the battlefield chosen by the enemy, confident in their ability to transform even an initial disadvantage into a conventional clash where discipline and technology would make the difference. The Harzhorn thus became the stage of a forced war experiment, an imperial army at the maximum of its technological power, but in enemy terrain and on the move, against an adversary who knew every path and every tree, determined to exploit that advantage to the last. The Battle of the Harzhorn did not explode as a single, catastrophic event, but developed as a symphony of violence divided into distinct acts, a sequence of crises and reactions whose rhythm is imprinted in the dispersion of the finds on the ground. It all begins with the movement of the long Roman column, probably in the process of retreating after a campaign of looting and show of force even further north. The rearguard, where the most intense signs of the clash were found, advanced along the path that ran along the slopes of the Harzhorn, a wooded plateau. The army, loaded with loot and prisoners, proceeded with the caution dictated by the hostile territory, but the forest maintained its impenetrable veil. It was then that the silence was broken. From the thicker woods on the ridge and from the heights north of the path, a sudden shower of javelins, stones and perhaps the first throwing axes fell on the Roman ranks. The ambush, classic in its ways, had taken place. The Germanic warriors, patiently positioned, had chosen the moment in which the most vulnerable part of the column, the rear guard with its wagons and perhaps the towed artillery, was most exposed. Their objective was clear: decapitate the Roman serpent, cut off the tail of the column, sow panic and disorder to transform an orderly retreat into a desperate rout. For a moment, the ghost of Teutoburg must have hovered among the trees. The Roman response, however, was a masterpiece of discipline applied under deadly pressure. Contrary to what the German commanders perhaps expected, the column did not disintegrate in the chaos. The trumpet signals must have resounded, stridently, above the battle cries. The rearguard soldiers and escort units turned towards the threat, quickly forming a coherent front line. Not an escape, but a conversion from marching order to battle formation, an evolution for which every legionary was trained from day one. It is in this phase that Roman tactical innovation became decisive. The carts that transported the carabalisti, instead of being cumbersome obstacles, were transformed into mobile fortresses. The artillerymen, protected by the infantrymen who raised their shields, began to charge and aim. From the heights, the Germans saw not fleeing prey, but an enemy organizing itself with frightening speed. And then, the backlash. A hail of lead and stone projectiles, hurled with parabolic trajectories, began to pound the German positions on the slopes. These projectiles, found in impressive concentrations on the north side of the trail, testify to targeted suppressive fire, not a random launch. The aim was not so much annihilation as to stop the assault, to force the warriors to seek shelter, to break their momentum. At the same time, the Roman infantry, perhaps the veterans of the legionary vexallations, began to advance. Not in a disorderly uphill charge, but methodically, protected by their shields, taking advantage of the artillery's covering fire and in turn throwing the lethal plumbati in the moment before impact. The battle, from a one-sided ambush, transformed into a fierce battle on the slopes. It was the crucial moment. The Germans, surprised by the resilience and firepower of the rearguard, found themselves engaged in a frontal combat they had not planned. This is where the battle moved from the rearguard towards the Harzhorn ridge. To support the counterattack and break through the Germanic lines that still held the heights, the Roman commanders made their decisive move. From the rear, or perhaps from the flanks of the main column, came the thunder of hooves. The Roman cavalry, held in reserve, went into action. They were not the heavy cataphracts, unsuitable for that wooded and sloping terrain, but almost certainly the equites dalmatarum and other light cavalry units. These squadrons, agile and fast, maneuvered to go around the flanks of the German deployment, taking advantage of probable depressions or lateral clearings. Their charge, or even just their threatening appearance on the sides, must have exerted tremendous psychological pressure on the foot warriors. Fighting Roman infantrymen advancing from below was one thing. Seeing the cavalry descend on them from one side, in a land that they considered their exclusive domain, was the blow that made the resistance falter. Under this pincer of artillery fire, frontal pressure and threat of cavalry encirclement, the German line began to give way. The final phase of the battle saw the Romans conquer the Harzhorn ridge. The fighting must have been ferocious, hand-to-hand between the tree trunks, but the coordinated Roman push was unstoppable. The German warriors, deprived of the advantage of the surprise ambush and tactically overcome, retreated into the dense forest behind the plateau, where the cavalry could not pursue them effectively. The Romans found themselves masters of the field. But, significantly, there was no wild chase. Discipline took over again. Maximinus' army, although victorious, was still deep within dangerous territory. The priority became to reorganize the column, treat the wounded, bury the fallen in hasty mass graves, of which no trace was found, perhaps a sign of an orderly retreat with its own dead, and, above all, resume the march towards the border and safety. They left indelible signs of the battle on the field, hundreds of artillery shells, arrow and javelin tips, equipment buckles, coins that set the date. They abandoned the ground to the fallen Germans and to the silence that, for almost 18 centuries, would have guarded the secret of that day in which the power of Rome had echoed, for the last time with such iron determination, in the forests north of the great river. The Battle of the Harzhorn reveals itself, in light of the finds, as a masterful example of tactical adaptation in extreme conditions, a demonstration that the Roman war machine of late antiquity was not a rigid colossus, but a flexible and lethal organism. The first element of tactical genius lies in the immediate reaction to an ambush. The transformation of a marching column, with its wagons and baggage trains, into a combat device capable of supporting and then overturning the assault, speaks of deeply internalized training. It was not simple passive resistance, but an active reconfiguration of the deployment. The rear commanders, whose name is lost forever, did not order them to close themselves in a static circle. Instead, they used vehicles and the terrain itself as support points for an offensive front line. The rear guard became, in a few minutes, the vanguard of the counterattack. This role reversal required not only courage, but a highly efficient chain of command and an instinctive understanding, on the part of every centurion and every optio, of the fundamental principle. The initiative must not be ceded, even when one is taken by surprise. The most revolutionary aspect of the Roman action was, without a doubt, the use of field artillery in a dynamic and close support role. The carabalisti were not deployed in a fixed rear position to bombard the enemy camp from a distance, as in traditional siege operations. The concentrations of pine cone-shaped projectiles instead indicate that these machines were operated almost like modern artillery pieces. They advanced with the infantry, or were positioned on small promontories along the trail, to provide suppressive fire directed against German positions on the slopes. This was a paradigm shift. It meant integrating heavy firepower into real-time tactical maneuver, using parabolic fire to hit an enemy positioned in high, wooded terrain, where direct line of fire was impossible. The roar of the winches, the hiss of the bullets in flight, the crash against the trees and the German shields must have created a devastating psychological effect, disorganizing the enemy lines just at the moment in which the Roman infantrymen began their climb. It was a use of artillery not as a preliminary breakthrough weapon, but as a continuous accompaniment tool, which broke the rhythm of the German attack and protected the advance of the infantry. The infantry itself demonstrated a sophisticated employment doctrine. The use of plumbati, heavy hand-thrown darts, was crucial in the critical space between 30 and 50 meters. Before the head-on clash, a rain of these projectiles, capable of piercing shields and light armor, must have fallen on the German ranks, causing casualties and creating breaking points in their formation. This weapon, symbol of the transition of the imperial army, allowed significant damage to be inflicted without breaking the compactness of one's line. The advance, therefore, was not a suicidal race, but a progressive, methodical checkerboard advance, where the units supported each other, taking advantage of the artillery curfew and the launching of the plumbati to gain meters on the slope. The discipline of the pace, the maintenance of alignment, the ability to fight in small groups in imperfect terrain were the result of constant training, forged in the frontier wars. Finally, coordination between the arms reached its peak with the intervention of the cavalry. Its use was neither premature nor reckless. The Roman commanders waited for the moment in which the infantry had firmly engaged the enemy, fixing it head-on, and the artillery had worn away its cohesion. Only then were the light cavalry squadrons launched into an outflanking action. Their maneuver did not require an open field charge. The simple threat of being caught on the flank, or from behind, in terrain that they believed to be safe, was enough to cause the definitive crisis in the German deployment. This sequence, fixation with infantry and fire, attrition, chivalrous outflanking, is the diagram of a coordinated tactic of the highest level. Demonstrates a deep understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of both your own and your opponent's army. At Harzhorn, Rome did not win by chance or superior brute strength. He won because, in the sudden chaos of the ambush, his officers and soldiers were able to put into practice, with cold precision, a complex and interconnected tactical repertoire, transforming a potential death trap into an overwhelming demonstration of systemic military superiority. It was the last, perfect leap of the legion as a multipurpose and adaptive organism, before the storms of the century imposed more static and defensive forms of warfare. On the other side of the hill, the tactical conduct of the Germanic commanders reveals an initially solid strategy, rooted in tradition and knowledge of the territory, but which met its fatal limit against an adversary capable of an unexpectedly elastic and technological reaction. The original plan was based on a skillful orchestration of the environment. The choice of place and time was not random. Wait until the most vulnerable part of the Roman column, the rear guard, with its heavy wagons and potential loot, was in a position away from the main army, and then strike with concentric violence from above. The tactical objective was classic and solidly effective. Isolate and annihilate a segment of the enemy, sowing chaos that would spread to the rest of the column, forced into narrow terrain. This scheme had worked countless times against less cohesive formations. The warriors demonstrated remarkable discipline in awaiting the order to attack, maintaining operational silence in the woods, and equally remarkable impetus in the initial execution. The launch of a first wave of projectiles, javelins, stones, axes, from above and from the thicket of the bush was supposed to create that crucial moment of shock and disorientation to bring down the organized resistance. However, their strategic calculation contained two faulty assumptions, which caused the battle to turn. The first was an underestimation of the readiness and resilience of the Roman military machine of late antiquity. The Germans probably expected to face a force similar to that of previous centuries, or perhaps a column already demoralized by the long campaign and weighed down by plunder. Instead, they faced an army permanently on alert, whose soldiers and commanders were veterans of countless border skirmishes, trained to view ambush not as a catastrophic exception, but as a constant occupational hazard. The speed with which the Romans went from marching to fighting formation, and, even more so, to a coordinated counterattack, must have been a shock to the attackers. The second and most serious error of evaluation concerned the technical capabilities of the opponent. The presence and such massive and mobile use of field artillery was a complete tactical surprise. There was nothing comparable in the German arsenal, nor probably in their war experience. The suppressive fire of the Carabalisti had no equivalent to react to. It could not be countered, only immediately. This technologically asymmetric element upset the pace of the attack. It forced the warriors, accustomed to concentrating on the visible enemy in front, to seek shelter from an invisible and arcing danger that rained down from above, fragmenting their cohesion and blocking the possibility of launching successive compact waves. The Germanic reaction to the Roman counterattack highlighted the structural limits of their military organization. While the Romans operated as a single body with specialized limbs, the Germanic force, while valiant, tended to fight as a collection of tribal groups or clans, whose cohesion depended on the initial success and charismatic presence of individual leaders. When the assault lost its momentum and turned into a brutal static uphill fight against armored and fire-supported infantry, individual initiative could not make up for the lack of a coordinated central tactical reserve or alternative plan. There is no evidence, for example, of an attempt to deeply outflank the Germans themselves to hit the center of the Roman column ahead, a move that could have forced the Romans to desist from supporting the rearguard. Their tactics remained fundamentally reactive, holding their position on the ridge. Finally, the intervention of the Roman cavalry on the flanks represented the final blow to the Germanic command and control system, which was by its nature more decentralized. The threat of encirclement, in a terrain that they considered their exclusive domain, probably broke the psychological bond that kept the various gangs together. Without a unified command capable of ordering a coordinated retreat to a pre-established fallback position, the disengagement risked turning into a disintegration. The retreat into the forest, although salvation, was the admission of the loss of control of the camp and of the initiative. Harzhorn's tactical lesson for the Germanic peoples was bitter but precious. The traditional ambush, however well conducted, was no longer sufficient against a determined and technologically superior Roman army. Future victories, like those that would follow a few decades later, would not only arise from courage and knowledge of the terrain, but from the ability to field much larger masses, to besiege fortresses and, above all, to challenge Rome in frontal-pitched battles, exploiting the growing internal crisis of the empire. Harzhorn also marked the end of an era for the German war. The immediate consequences of the Battle of the Harzhorn unfold on two distinct and almost paradoxical levels, that of celebration and that of strategic reality. For Maximinus the Thracian, the victory in that remote corner of Germany was a propaganda triumph of inestimable value. He masterfully coincided with his need to legitimize a power born from the blade of a sword. The imperial mint began minting coins proclaiming German Victoria, showing the emperor in a triumphal attitude, often with a trophy of arms at his feet and a German prisoner sitting in submission. This iconography, widespread throughout the empire, served a dual purpose: to appease the Senate and people of Rome with the figure of a victorious leader, and to cement the bond with the army, demonstrating that under his leadership the legions were still purveyors of glory and booty. The campaign was probably presented as an exemplary punishment, a restoration of order and fear on the northern border. In this, Maximinus succeeded perfectly, at least in the short term. His image as a soldier emperor, capable of bringing the war to the heart of the barbarian territory, must have resonated powerfully among the ranks of the legions, even those far from the Rhine. However, the absence of detailed historical sources that celebrate the episode with the epic tone reserved for other victories suggests that, despite the propaganda, the importance of the undertaking was not fully understood or perhaps voluntarily minimized by the senatorial aristocracy, who continued to look at the soldier who came from Thrace. On a concrete and strategic level, the paradox is jarring. The battle was an indisputable tactical victory, a brilliant success under conditions of an initial disadvantage. Yet, it led to no territorial change, no annexation, no permanent reoccupation. Maximin's army, after having defeated the German resistance on the Harzhorn, did not establish fortresses or annex lands. He simply regrouped and completed his return march towards the Limes. This apparent contradiction is the key to understanding the profound nature of the operation. The aim was not reconquest, a concept that had been foreign to Roman politics in that sector for 2 centuries. The purpose was demonstration. The expedition was an immense operation of psychological and political deterrence. His message was clear: Rome could still, if provoked, project its power hundreds of kilometers beyond the border, strike at the sanctuaries, economies and pride of tribes in their own land, and emerge victorious. It was a bloody warning, carved with the lead bullets of the ballistae and the swords of the vexallations, destined to delay the next attack. In this sense, the battle may have achieved a medium-term strategic objective: to intimidate the Alemannic Confederation and neighboring tribes, gaining precious time for an empire that had to direct its resources elsewhere, mainly towards the dangerous Danubian and eastern fronts. The consequences for the Germanic world are more difficult to discern, but no less profound. The defeat, inflicted not in a defense of the border but in an attack on its own territory, must have constituted a significant trauma. For decades, the collective memory of the tribes had celebrated Teutoburg as the symbol of Roman vulnerability in the forests. Harzhorn overturned that myth. It demonstrated that the legions were no longer the same, that they could penetrate, fight and win even in that same type of environment. This event may have contributed to a temporary slowdown in large-scale pressure against the Germanic limes, pushing the tribes into reorganization and reflection. The lesson learned was not Roman invincibility, but the need for even larger coalitions, more sophisticated organization, and, perhaps, to wait until the empire was distracted by even more serious internal crises. In a certain sense, Harzhorn may have indirectly accelerated the process of political coalescence between the tribes, pushing them towards those macro formations which, within a few decades, would have broken through the limes in force. The battle's most singular fate, however, was oblivion. As Maximinus coins continued to circulate, memory of the specific event quickly faded from the chronicles. The reasons are multiple. The violent death of Maximinus in 238 AD, killed by his own soldiers during the siege of Aquileia in the midst of the senatorial revolt, made him a damnatio memoriae, someone condemned to oblivion. His deeds were deliberately minimized or erased by subsequent historiography, controlled by the aristocracy who had hated him. The military anarchy that followed, with its frenetic sequence of ephemeral emperors and civil wars, buried under a mountain of dramatic events and closer to Rome the memory of a campaign in a distant forest. Finally, the fact that the victory did not produce permanent territorial change made it, for ancient historians, a minor episode, a frontier skirmish magnified by the propaganda of a usurper. Thus, the last great Roman offensive in Germany vanished in silence, its memory preserved not by parchments, but by the damp earth of a hill, by fragments of rusty metal and stones thrown by machines, awaiting a rediscovery that would have required rewriting a fundamental chapter of the epical clash between Rome and the Germanic world. The awakening of the Harzhorn from its long historic night, which began in 2008, represented much more than the simple discovery of an archaeological site. It was an act of correcting the collective memory of the West. Every Caliga nail, every worn buckle, every lead bullet deformed by the impact, constitutes a silent but incontrovertible testimony that challenges the traditional narrative of a Roman Empire now on the defensive, folded behind its walls. The very distribution of the finds on the ground, mapped with modern technologies, has made it possible to reconstruct the anatomy of the clash, almost like an investigator unravels a 1,000-year-old cold case. The high concentration of artillery shells in specific areas reveals the main firing points, tracing virtual lines of fire that converge on the slopes where the Germans were positioned. Arrow and javelin heads mark the distances of close combat. The absence of mass graves and the relative order of the objects speak not of a massacre, but of a battlefield controlled by the victors, who were able to treat their wounded and bury the fallen in a more appropriate place during the march. Archaeology, in this case, has become the first and most truthful historian, offering a tangible chronicle that overcomes the prejudice and oblivion of written sources. The ultimate meaning of this battle is crystallized in its emblematic temporal location. Harzhorn represents Rome's last, powerful offensive roar north of the Limes. After this undertaking, no other imperial army would have pushed with such determination and such profound strength into Germania Magna for purely punitive and demonstrative purposes. The following decades saw German pressure grow inexorably, while the empire, torn by civil wars, invasions and the secession of entire regions, was transformed. The war became increasingly defensive, conducted from fortresses and along fortified lines, until, well into the 3rd century, those lines themselves gave way under the impact of the great migrations. Harzhorn is therefore an invisible watershed. The last time the eagles moved freely, albeit for a short and bloody flight, in that territory that they had given up on dominating but not terrorizing. It marks the end of an era of strategic initiative and the beginning of a long era of containment and, ultimately, reckoning. A historical revaluation imposed by the finds inevitably affects the figure of Maximinus the Thracian. Traditionally portrayed as a crude tyrant by senatorial chronicles, the man who planned and led the Harzhorn campaign now emerges as a commander of remarkable audacity and competence. Under his leadership, the Roman army demonstrated operational flexibility, inter-army coordination and logistical resilience that are the sign of a war machine still at its most efficient. His ability to conceive such a risky operation and carry it out, achieving a landslide tactical victory under adverse conditions, speaks of a strategic mind that is anything but primitive. Maximinus was perhaps the last emperor to fully understand and use, in a titanic coup, the offensive potential of the late imperial army before internal crises irremediably wore out its heart. His politically motivated damnatio memoriae buried this dimension of his reign for centuries. In conclusion, the Battle of the Harzhorn is not the story of a forgotten victory, but of a resurfaced truth. It is proof that history, like the earth, preserves layers of reality that are often more complex than those transmitted by written tradition, bound to the prejudices of the winners of political battles. The Harzhorn Hill today is not a monument to defeat, like Teutoburg, nor to a victory that changed the world. It is a monument to resilience, to the extraordinary ability of an institution to adapt under extreme stress. It tells of an empire already in the grip of chaos that, in the eye of the storm, still found the energy, the discipline and the iron will to send a message through fire and iron, a message that echoed in the Germanic forests for some time, before being drowned by the clamor of a century of iron. Its rediscovery requires us to look at the 3rd century not only as an era of decadence and fragmentation, but also as a period in which the old structures, before giving way, demonstrated a surprising power and vitality, capable of episodes of pure epic strength. The Harzhorn is the last act of a dialogue that began centuries earlier between Rome and Germany, a dialogue made up of clashes, exchanges and misunderstandings, which would forever shape the face of Europe. That wooded hill holds the last, thunderous chapter of an offensive war, after which the sound of the marching legions in the far north would become only an echo, and then silence.